I took the job at the cathedral because it seemed peaceful, even a little charming in its own way. The description had been simple. Clean the floors, dust the pews, and keep the place tidy after hours. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady work, and I needed that. On my first day, I arrived just before sunset. The cathedral loomed before me, its stone facade weathered by time but still standing proud. The evening light painted the stained glass windows with streaks of red and gold, making them look like glowing eyes watching from a distance. I paused at the massive wooden doors, noticing how the intricate carvings seemed more like scars than designs. It was beautiful, but in a way that felt heavy, almost suffocating. Inside, the air was cool and carried the faint scent of incense, even though no service had been held that day. My footsteps echoed as I walked down the long aisle, the sound swallowed by the high ceilings and the vast emptiness around me. The caretaker, Mr. Shaw, greeted me near the altar. He was a wiry man in his 60s with a face that seemed as carved as the building itself. He wore a dark coat, even indoors, and carried a ring of keys that jingled faintly as he moved. "You'll get used to it," he said, his voice rough like stone grinding against stone. I wasn't sure if he meant the size of the place or its silence. He handed me a checklist on a clipboard, walking me through my duties with an efficiency that left no room for small talk. Dusting, mopping, polishing, basic cleaning tasks, all laid out with precise instructions. The only thing that seemed odd was how insistent he was about certain details. "Always lock up the side doors when you're done," he said. "Check twice. Some of the locks stick, and we've had issues before." "What kind of issues?" I asked, half curious, half distracted by the way his gaze seemed to linger on the statues flanking the walls. "Just make sure they're locked," he said sharply, moving on without answering. As the evening wore on, I started to settle into my work. The cathedral felt larger with each step, as if it stretched when I wasn't looking. The light from the high windows faded slowly, and soon, the only illumination came from the dim overhead lights that buzzed faintly. I found myself drawn to the statues. They lined the walls, each one tall and imposing, carved in stunning detail. Saints, angels, and martyrs, all frozen in moments of reverence or sacrifice. Their faces were serene, but their eyes seemed alive. As I dusted the base of one statue, I noticed something strange. The stone looked darker in some places, almost like stains that hadn't been cleaned properly. I wiped at it harder, but the marks wouldn't fade. Struck me as odd, but I shrugged it off. It was small things at first, barely enough to register. The sound of something shifting, though I saw nothing move. A faint breeze that brushed against my neck, though all the doors were closed. And then there was the feeling of being watched. It started while I was polishing the brass candelabras near the altar. The weight of it settled on my shoulders, growing heavier until I couldn't ignore it. I turned quickly, expecting to see someone behind me, but there was no one there, just the empty pews and the statues standing motionless in their niches. I laughed at myself, a quick, nervous sound that echoed strangely in the silence. "Get a grip," I muttered, shaking my head. By the time I finished my first round of cleaning, the cathedral felt entirely different. The air seemed heavier, the shadows longer and darker. I glanced at the clock hanging near the entrance. It was almost 10 p.m. Mr. Shaw had told me to leave by 11, though he hadn't said why. I gathered my things and prepared to lock up, double-checking the side doors as instructed. The locks were stubborn, just as he'd warned. But as I reached the last door, I hesitated. I felt it again, that strange pull, like something was behind me, just out of sight. I turned quickly, scanning the room. The statues stood as they always had, their features carved and cold. But for a moment, A fleeting, breathless moment. I could have sworn one of them wasn't facing the same direction as before. My breath caught in my throat, and I stared, waiting for my eyes to adjust or for some rational explanation to surface. But nothing happened. I locked the door and left quickly, the sound of my footsteps unnaturally loud against the stone floors. As I stepped out into the cool night air, I glanced back at the cathedral. The windows no longer glowed, and the building stood dark and silent against the sky. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was still inside, watching me as I walked away. That was my first night. And even then, I knew this job wasn't going to be as simple as I had thought. When I arrived for my second shift at the cathedral, the place felt quieter than before, if that was even possible. The lingering daylight barely touched the stone walls, and the stained glass, which had seemed warm and vibrant the day before, now looked cold and muted. I walked in, my steps echoing in the empty hall, and found Mr. Shaw waiting for me near the altar. He wasn't his usual brisk self. Instead, he seemed distracted, his gaze darting around the room like he was trying to spot something just out of view. "You'll be working alone again tonight," he said abruptly, as if I'd asked a question. "I figured," I replied, glancing at my checklist from the night before. "Anything else I need to know?" For a moment, he didn't answer. Then, as if deciding something, he nodded toward the side door. "There are some things you should keep in mind," he said, his voice unusually low. Mr. Shaw led me to the corner of the room where a small desk was tucked away, covered in papers, old ledgers, and what looked like blueprints of the cathedral. He pulled out a worn notebook and opened it to a page filled with handwritten notes. "These aren't rules exactly," he said, tapping the page with a finger. "More like guidelines." I leaned in to read. "Lock all side doors before 11 p.m. Don't touch the bell ropes unless instructed. Avoid the back storage room unless absolutely necessary. If you hear footsteps, stay where you are and wait until they stop. Never leave any lights on in the nave after midnight." The list was oddly specific, and I couldn't help but raise an eyebrow. "What happens if I break one of these guidelines?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. Mr. Shaw didn't laugh. He didn't even smile. "Just don't," he said flatly, closing the notebook and handing it to me. I stared at the notebook in my hands, the words blurring slightly as my mind raced. These weren't normal instructions for a cleaning job. I tried to tell myself it was probably just some old superstition, a relic of the church's past. But the way Mr. Shaw looked at me, the seriousness in his eyes, made it hard to dismiss. That night, as I worked through my tasks, I couldn't shake the feeling that the notebook was more than just a set of suggestions. I started with the basics: sweeping, mopping, dusting the pews. The routine should have been comforting, but every time I glanced at the statues, I felt that familiar weight in the air. The rules buzzed in my mind, nagging at me, especially the one about the footsteps. I was in the process of polishing the brass candle holders near the altar when I heard it. Faint, rhythmic sound. Tap, 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 like someone walking slowly on the stone floor. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. I turned my head slowly, scanning the room. The shadows seemed deeper than they should have been, stretching in ways that made no sense. "Don't be ridiculous," I whispered to myself, trying to laugh it off. But my voice sounded small even to me. I decided to take the rules seriously, if only to ease my nerves. As the clock ticked closer to 11 p.m., I made my way to the side doors, checking each lock twice. The keys were heavy in my hand, and more than once, I had to jiggle them to get the old mechanisms to turn. When I reached the back storage room, I hesitated. The door was slightly ajar, just enough to make me wonder if I should peek inside. The rule about avoiding this room echoed in my head. It seemed silly to be scared of a storage closet, but something about the dark gap between the door and the frame made my skin crawl. I reached out to push it closed, but before my fingers touched the wood, I heard a faint creak, like the sound of something shifting inside. My hand jerked back instinctively, and I stumbled away, my heart pounding. It's just old wood settling, I told myself. Nothing to worry about. Still, I left the door alone and hurried back to the main hall, my nerves on edge. By midnight, I was nearly done with my shift. The air had grown colder, and the faint hum of the overhead lights was starting to grate on my nerves. I kept glancing at the bell ropes, hanging silently in the corner of the room. The rule about not touching them seemed ridiculous. They were just ropes, after all. But there was something about them, the way they swayed ever so slightly, even though there was no breeze, that made me keep my distance. As I wiped down the pews, I thought about asking Mr. Shaw more questions. But I already knew what he'd say. Just follow the guidelines. While tidying up near the altar, I noticed a folded piece of paper tucked under one of the heavy candlesticks. Curiosity got the better of me, and I unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was uneven, almost frantic. They don't like the light. Keep it dark, and they won't notice you. My hands trembled as I read the words. It had to be a joke, some leftover scrap from years ago. But why leave it there, hidden like that? I folded the note back up and tucked it into my pocket, my heart racing. By the time midnight rolled around, I was more than ready to leave. The cathedral felt alive in a way that had nothing to do with faith or history. I walked quickly to the light switches near the entrance, flipping them off one by one. The nave plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon through the stained glass. I turned to leave, but as I reached for the door, I stopped. The sound of footsteps echoed softly behind me. I turned, my breath hitching in my chest, and saw nothing but shadows and stone. The statues stood where they always had, their faces calm and unmoving. But one of them, a tall figure near the back, seemed closer than before. I didn't wait to find out if my eyes were playing tricks on me. I locked the door and left, my steps hurried and uneven. As I walked home that night, I couldn't stop thinking about the notebook, the note, and the strange sounds I'd heard. The rules weren't just there to keep the place in order, they were there to keep something at bay. Whatever was happening in that cathedral, I wasn't sure I wanted to find out. But I knew I'd have to return the next night. I didn't want to go back the next night, but I needed the job. Rent didn't pay itself, and I couldn't justify leaving over a few strange feelings and odd sounds. That's what I kept telling myself as I stood outside the cathedral doors, staring at the darkened windows. The air felt colder than usual, and I noticed how the streetlights didn't reach the building's entrance. It stood in shadow, isolated from the world around it. Taking a deep breath, I unlocked the heavy doors and stepped inside. The silence hit me immediately. Not the peaceful kind you might expect in a place like this, but the kind that presses against your ears, making you feel like you're being watched. I decided to start with the side doors, locking them like Mr. Shaw had instructed. It was routine now, almost muscle memory. But as I reached the last door, I stopped. It was already open. I distinctly remembered locking it the night before. The rusty mechanism had been stubborn, and I double-checked it just to be sure. Now, the door stood ajar, the darkness outside spilling in like a thick, black fog. I swallowed hard, pushing the door closed and locking it again. Maybe Mr. Shaw came back this morning and forgot to lock up, I muttered, trying to convince myself. But deep down, I didn't believe that. As I moved through the cathedral, the noises started again. Soft and subtle, just enough to prick at my nerves. A faint creak from the pews, the soft shuffle of something brushing against the stone floor. I paused, listening intently. My pulse thudded in my ears, making it hard to tell if the sounds were real or just my imagination. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing back at me. The cathedral remained still, its shadows unyielding. I tried to focus on my tasks, telling myself there had to be logical explanations for everything. But when I reached the altar, my cleaning bucket was gone. I'd left it there just a few minutes earlier, filled with supplies I needed for polishing the brass fixtures. Now the space was empty, as if it had never been there. I looked around, scanning the nearby pews and corners of the room. There was no sign of the bucket. "This is ridiculous," I muttered, feeling a mix of frustration and unease. I searched the entire nave, my footsteps growing faster and more uneven as I moved. Finally, I found the bucket in the back storage room, sitting neatly in the center of the floor. I hadn't gone near the storage room all night. Returning to the main hall, I kept glancing over my shoulder. The shadows seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them, stretching and bending in ways that made no sense. At one point, while cleaning near the statues, I caught something in my peripheral vision. A dark shape, small and quick, darting between the pews. I turned sharply, my heart pounding, but the space was empty. "Get a grip," I told myself, forcing a shaky laugh. But the unease in my chest didn't fade. By the time I reached the far end of the nave, the feeling was undeniable. Someone or something was watching me. I could feel it, like a weight pressing against my back, heavy and unrelenting. It wasn't the statues, I told myself. They were just stone. Cold, unmoving, lifeless stone. But when I turned to face them, my breath caught in my throat. One of the statues, an angel with outstretched wings, looked different. Its head was tilted slightly, its gaze no longer fixed straight ahead but down toward me. I blinked, my pulse roaring in my ears. When I looked again, the statue was back to its original position, calm and serene. I leaned against one of the pews, trying to steady my breathing. This wasn't normal. None of it was. I thought about the note I'd found the night before. "They don't like the light." What did that mean? Was it connected to the shadows, the noises, the shifting statues? My logical side told me I was imagining things, that stress and isolation were playing tricks on my mind. But another part of me, the part that couldn't ignore the heavy, watchful presence in the room, knew something wasn't right. As I moved toward the light switches, intending to leave early, the overhead lights began to flicker. At first, it was just one or two, their soft hum stuttering for a moment before returning to normal. But then the entire row of lights blinked erratically, plunging the room into brief, jarring darkness before flickering back to life. In those moments of darkness, I saw it. A figure, tall, cloaked in shadow, standing at the far end of the hall. It was only there for a split second, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. When the lights stabilized, the figure was gone. I stumbled toward the entrance, my hands trembling as I fumbled for the keys. The rules ran through my mind like a mantra. Lock the doors, turn off the lights, don't touch the bell ropes. Were the rules meant to keep things in order, or were they meant to protect me? The thought made my stomach churn. As I locked the last door and stepped outside, I couldn't bring myself to look back at the cathedral. I felt like the building was watching me, its dark windows filled with unseen eyes. The night air was cold and sharp against my skin, but it did little to calm me. My thoughts raced as I walked home, the sound of my own footsteps too loud in the quiet streets. I didn't want to go back, but I knew I didn't have a choice. Whatever was happening inside that cathedral wasn't going to stop, and part of me needed to know why. By the time I reached the cathedral for my next shift, I felt like I was walking into a storm I couldn't see. Every instinct told me to turn around, to leave and never come back. But I couldn't. A part of me needed answers, even if I didn't want to admit it. As I stepped inside, the heavy door groaned shut behind me, and the air inside felt colder than ever. My footsteps echoed faintly, swallowed by the vast silence that now felt oppressive rather than peaceful. I decided to stick to the checklist, thinking that keeping busy might settle my nerves. But from the moment I began, things felt wrong. I started with the side doors, checking and locking each one. They were all secure, just as I'd left them the night before. That should have reassured me, but it didn't. The statues seemed more imposing tonight, their shadows longer and darker in the dim light. I caught myself avoiding their gazes, as though looking too long might reveal something I wasn't ready to see. As I moved through the tasks, the noises started again. Faint at first, just the creak of wood and the soft hum of the lights. But as the night wore on, they grew louder. While dusting the pews near the center of the nave, I felt it again, the weight of someone watching me. It was stronger this time, pressing against my shoulders like a hand I couldn't see. I spun around quickly, my heart pounding. In the flickering light, I thought I saw movement near the back of the hall. A figure standing just outside the edge of the shadows. "Who's there?" I called, my voice shaking despite my attempt to sound firm. The figure didn't move. I took a step closer, gripping the feather duster like it was a weapon. My eyes strained against the darkness, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But before I could get a clear view, the lights above me blinked out, plunging the entire cathedral into darkness. For a moment I froze. The silence was absolute, like the building itself was holding its breath. Then, faintly, I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere in the shadows. My hand fumbled for the flashlight I'd brought with me, but when I clicked it on, the beam barely seemed to penetrate the darkness. It was as though the shadows were thicker than they should have been, swallowing the light before it could reach the walls. "Mr. Shaw," I called, though I already knew it wasn't him. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a faint whispering sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, low and urgent, like someone was warning me to leave. My heart raced as I tried to focus on the rules. Lock the doors, don't touch the bell ropes, turn off the lights. But the lights were already off, and the doors. I realized with a sinking feeling that I hadn't locked the last one. The whispers grew louder as I made my way toward the entrance, my footsteps quick and uneven. The flashlight flickered in my hand, and I clenched it tighter, willing it to stay on. When I reached the door, it was wide open. The cold night air blew in, carrying with it the faint scent of something metallic, like rust or blood. I shut the door quickly, my hands trembling as I turned the key in the lock. When I turned back toward the nave, I stopped in my tracks. The angel statue, the one with the outstretched wings, was no longer where it had been. It now stood in the center of the aisle, its head tilted just enough to make it look like it was watching me. I stared at it, my mind racing. It was impossible. I hadn't heard it move, hadn't seen anything. But there it was, as solid and real as the stone floor beneath my feet. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now, and I realized they were coming from the direction of the bell ropes. I didn't want to go near them, but something pulled me forward. My legs felt like they were moving on their own, carrying me toward the dark corner of the cathedral where the ropes hung. The angel statue seemed to follow me, though I never saw it move. Each time I glanced back, it was closer, its wings casting sharp, jagged shadows across the walls. When I reached the ropes, the whispers stopped. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, without warning, the ropes began to sway, as though pulled by invisible hands. I had two choices. I could follow the rules and leave the ropes alone, or I could pull one and see what happened. My fingers hovered over the nearest rope, my mind screaming at me to stop. But before I could decide, the sound of footsteps returned, louder this time, coming straight toward me. In a panic, I grabbed the rope and pulled hard. The bell above me let out a deep, resonant clang that shook the entire building. The sound echoed endlessly, reverberating through the cathedral like a warning. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was nothing but the fading hum of the bell. Then, slowly, the angel statue turned its head. I don't know how I knew, but I felt it the moment its gaze locked onto me. My chest tightened, and I stumbled backward, my flashlight clattering to the floor. The shadows around me seemed to grow thicker, closing in until I couldn't see anything but the faint outline of the statue. The whispers started again, louder and more frantic this time, as if whatever was inside the cathedral was furious. And then, just as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. The lights flickered back on, and the statue was gone. The bell ropes hung motionless, and the air felt lighter, as though whatever presence had been there had vanished. I grabbed my flashlight and ran, not bothering to lock the doors behind me. As I stepped into the cold night air, I realized I wasn't breathing properly. My chest ached, and my legs felt like they might give out at any moment. I didn't look back at the cathedral. I didn't want to see if the angel was standing in the doorway, watching me leave. But I knew one thing for certain. Something inside that building wasn't just stone and shadows. And it wasn't finished with me. I didn't go back to the cathedral after that night. Couldn't. When Mr. Shaw called the next morning to ask why I hadn't locked up properly, I didn't know how to explain it. I muttered something about forgetting and promised it wouldn't happen again, though I had no intention of setting foot inside that building ever again. For days, I replayed the events in my head, trying to make sense of what I'd seen and felt. I told myself it was stress, exhaustion, maybe even my imagination running wild in the dim light of that ancient place. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the truth. The angel statue haunted me most of all. I couldn't forget the way it seemed to follow me, moving without sound or warning. I'd always dismissed stories of inanimate objects coming to life as nonsense, but now, every time I closed my eyes, I saw its tilted head, its blank, unfeeling gaze. The note I'd found, "They don't like the light," echoed in my mind. Who had written it? And why had it been left there, hidden under the candlestick like a message for someone who wasn't supposed to find it? The rules, the whispers, the strange presence in the shadows, none of it added up. And yet, it all felt connected, like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't solve. I started noticing small changes in my daily life. The air in my apartment felt heavier, like the cathedral's atmosphere had followed me home. Shadows in the corners of my room seemed darker, deeper, though I knew it was just my imagination. Or at least that's what I told myself. Once, while walking home late at night, I thought I saw the outline of a figure standing beneath a street lamp. It didn't move, didn't come closer, but its presence sent chills down my spine. When I blinked, it was gone. Sleep became difficult. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against my window made me sit up, my heart racing. I thought about calling Mr. Shaw to ask him what he knew. Surely, he'd worked there long enough to have noticed something strange. But every time I picked up the phone, I stopped myself. What would I even say? "Hey, I think the statues in the cathedral are alive?" He'd think I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had. The worst part was not knowing. Was it just that building? Or was it me? The last time I spoke to Mr. Shaw, he ended the call with something that stayed with me ever since. "You did well to leave when you did," he said, his voice unusually soft. "Not everyone does." He hung up before I could ask what he meant. I haven't told anyone what happened. Not fully. When people ask why I left the job, I make up excuses: bad hours, too much work, poor pay. It's easier than explaining the truth, especially when I don't fully understand it myself. But sometimes, late at night, I think I hear the faint sound of bells in the distance. And every now and then, when I pass by the cathedral on my way to the market or the bus stop, I swear I see something move behind the stained glass. Just for a second. I always walk a little faster after that. Subscribe for more horror stories every day.